The briefing room fell silent when General Hawkins slid the reconnaissance photos across the table. Satellite imagery showed a fortress carved into the mountains of northern Kandahar, bristling with anti-aircraft emplacements that formed a deadly constellation around a single compound. Intelligence confirmed what everyone feared. Senator Morty's son and 3 other Marines were being held in that concrete maze, scheduled for execution in 72 hours. The Taliban had turned the site into a showcase of captured American weaponry, a propaganda coup that would broadcast worldwide. Every air corridor leading to the target sat under overlapping fields of fire from Russian-made ZSU-23-4 systems, Chinese HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, and enough shoulder-fired stingers to light up the sky like the 4th of July. The general's voice carried the weight of impossible mathematics when he spoke. No strike package could penetrate that envelope without catastrophic losses. Stealth fighters couldn't operate in that terrain. Cruise missiles lacked the precision needed with hostages present. The mountain's radar shadow made targeting solutions nearly impossible. Every war-gamed scenario ended with the same conclusion: mission failure or total loss of aircraft. The politicians wanted action. The Pentagon wanted results, but the laws of physics and warfare didn't negotiate. Captain Raven Vasquez sat in the back row, her flight suit creased from 14 hours of standby alert. Most of the room didn't notice her, their attention fixed on the grim faces of F-16 squadron commanders shaking their heads, of Apache pilots calculating impossible odds. She studied the topographical maps with the quiet intensity of someone reading a language others had forgotten. The mountains formed a natural amphitheater, channels carved by ancient rivers that no longer flowed. Her fingers traced invisible lines across the laminated surface, while fighter jocks debated ordnance loads for missions they'd never fly. Someone mentioned her aircraft designation like it was a punchline. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog, was a relic from the Cold War, designed to kill Soviet tanks in German fields, not dance through mountain passes under modern air defenses. Slow, ugly, vulnerable. Those were the words that followed her airframe into every planning session. General Hawkins cleared his throat, ready to declare the mission scrubbed pending alternative solutions, which everyone understood meant waiting for the hostages to die. That's when Raven stood up. The sound of her chair scraping linoleum carried more authority than she'd intended. Eyes turned, some annoyed at the interruption, others curious. She walked forward, her combat boots striking the floor with measured cadence, and pointed at the northern approach corridor everyone had dismissed. Her voice came steady, almost conversational, as she explained why everyone was looking at the problem wrong. The room's temperature seemed to drop. The general's expression shifted from irritation to something harder to read. When she finished speaking, the silence stretched long enough that she wondered if she just ended her career. Then Hawkins did something nobody expected. He smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. He called it exactly what it was: a suicide run. Raven's response became legend before the sun set. She laughed, not mockery, not bravado, just the genuine amusement of someone who'd been counted out before, and said she'd need full tanks and 45 minutes to pre-flight. The pre-dawn darkness at Bagram Air Base carried the chemical tang of jet fuel and the distant percussion of artillery fire that never really stopped. Raven walked her pre-flight inspection, while crew chiefs moved through practiced rhythms around her aircraft. The A-10 sat on the tarmac like a gargoyle, all hard angles and brutal functionality. Its titanium bathtub cockpit formed an armored shell designed to absorb punishment that would vaporize other aircraft. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon dominated the fuselage, 7 barrels capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at 70 rounds per second, creating a sound that enemy combatants called the Devil's Roar. Twin General Electric turbofan engines sat high on the rear fuselage, protected from ground fire, and positioned to keep running even if one engine died. Every rivet and plate had purpose, no elegance, just the grim efficiency of a machine built to survive. She ran her hands along the leading edge of the wing, checking for damage, feeling for the subtle imperfections that pre-flight checklists couldn't quantify. The weapon's load told its own story. AGM-65 Mavericks for precision strikes, Hydra rocket pods for area suppression, and the full ammunition drum for the cannon, 1,100 rounds of 30mm hate. Auxiliary fuel tanks stretched her range just far enough. The mathematics were brutal. Fuel consumption versus target distance versus combat duration versus emergency reserve. There wasn't margin for error, just calculated acceptance of risk. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb approached from the operations building, his tablet glowing in the darkness. He'd volunteered as forward air controller for the mission, which meant he'd be on the ground with the Marines who'd attempt extraction if she somehow cleared the defenses. They'd flown together in Syria, back when everyone still thought precision warfare could be clean. He didn't waste words on sentiment or false encouragement. Instead, he handed her updated imagery showing 2 additional ZSU positions that intelligence had missed. She studied them without comment, then asked about the weather window. High-altitude winds, he reported, were projected at 40 knots from the northwest, which would affect her approach angle by 7 degrees. She committed the numbers to memory. Their eyes met briefly, carrying conversations they'd never speak aloud about acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. The maintenance chief signed off her aircraft with a grease-stained thumbprint on the acceptance form. Technical Sergeant Alvarez had kept her Warthog flying through 3 deployments and 2 engine replacements. He'd painted her call sign beneath the canopy rail in precise block letters, Mockingbird. The origin of that designation carried weight she rarely discussed. 5 years earlier, during her first combat deployment, an Air Force colonel had dismissed her tactical recommendations during a briefing, suggesting she should stick to singing pretty for the brass instead of pretending to understand combat aviation. She'd taken the mockery and transformed it into identity. Mockingbirds, she'd learned, don't just sing. They mimic, adapt, survive in hostile territories by becoming what predators don't expect. The name stuck, acquiring layers of meaning with each mission. Now it represented something the colonel hadn't intended, underestimation as tactical advantage. Alvarez met her eyes and said her bird was ready to bite. She nodded, accepting the benediction of a man whose professional judgment she trusted more than most officers. The equipment strapped to her body carried its own familiar weight. Survival vest with radio beacon, sidearm she'd probably never use, harness that would either save her life or become her tomb depending on what happened in the next 2 hours. The tower cleared her for departure as false dawn painted the eastern peaks in shades of amber and violet. Engine start procedures flowed through muscle memory, each switch and indicator monitored with ritualistic precision. The turbofans spooled up with their distinctive high-pitched whine, different from the aggressive roar of fighters, more like industrial machinery preparing for ugly work. She taxied to the runway threshold, running final systems checks while coordinating with the E-3 Sentry AWACS orbiting somewhere over the Pakistani border. Their calm voices fed her updated threat assessments and confirmed no friendly aircraft would enter her operational area. This was her show, her sky, her calculated impossibility. Tower Control's final clearance came through with unusual formality, and she caught the subtext. Nobody expected her to return. The runway stretched ahead, concrete scarred by countless departures, and she advanced the throttles with steady pressure. The Warthog accelerated with determined momentum rather than fighter jet violence, building speed until she rotated and climbed into air that would either carry her to legend or oblivion. The flight toward the target took her through valleys that maps rendered as contour lines, but reality revealed as knife-edge ridges and shadows deep enough to hide armies. She maintained radio silence, navigating by terrain features and GPS coordinates while staying below radar coverage. The A-10 flew at altitudes that made fighter pilots nervous, close enough to see individual boulders and abandoned Soviet-era vehicles rusting in forgotten wars. Her hands on the controls felt extensions of thought rather than mechanical inputs, making constant micro-adjustments for thermals rising from sun-warmed rock faces. The mission clock counted down with arithmetic finality. Intelligence updates filtered through her helmet speakers in compressed bursts. Hostages confirmed alive as of 30 minutes prior. Defenses on heightened alert following overnight coalition activity elsewhere. The mountains rose around her like cathedral walls built by tectonic violence, indifferent to the human conflicts playing out in their shadows. She checked fuel levels, weapons systems, emergency procedures she'd rehearsed until they became autonomic responses. The northern approach corridor materialized ahead, exactly as topographical maps had promised, but infinitely more lethal in 3 dimensions. The first indication of threat came not from radar warning receivers, but from visual confirmation. The distinctive silhouette of a ZSU-23-4 traversing its radar dish in methodical search patterns. She banked hard right, using a ridge line for cover, and began the attack run that would either vindicate her tactical analysis or prove the skeptics correct. The compound appeared through morning haze, exactly where satellite imagery had placed it, but somehow more real, more immediate. Guard towers dotted the perimeter. Vehicle emplacements suggested at least 40 combatants. The hostages were somewhere in that concrete maze, counting hours they didn't have. She armed the Mavericks, designated targets through the targeting pod, and began the sequence that would announce her presence to every air defense system within 20 kilometers. The GAU-8 cannon spun up with a mechanical whir, barrels rotating in anticipation. The general's words echoed in her memory, suicide run. But Raven Vasquez had stopped measuring her life by other people's expectations years ago. She pushed the throttles forward and committed to the attack. The first Maverick left the rail with a solid thunk that resonated through the airframe, its rocket motor igniting in a streak of white exhaust that drew a line directly to her position. The missile tracked true, impacting the northern SAM site in a bloom of orange fire that sent debris spiraling across the compound. Before the explosion's echo could fade, she'd already pickled the second Maverick, targeting the ZSU position that threatened her egress route. Radar warning receivers screamed their electronic panic as multiple tracking systems locked onto her aircraft. The threat display lit up like a Christmas tree, symbols representing weapons designed specifically to kill aircraft like hers. She broke hard left, dumping chaff and flares in patterns calculated to confuse infrared and radar guidance systems. A Stinger missile lanced upward from the eastern perimeter, its seeker head tracking the heat signature of her engines. She rolled inverted, pulled -G until her vision grayed, and the missile flashed past close enough that she saw its stabilizer fins. The compound's defenders were reacting now, tracers from heavy machine guns scribing bright arcs through the morning air. She calculated trajectories with pilots' instinct and combat experience, recognizing patterns in the chaos. The radio crackled with Webb's voice, professional despite the circumstances. Mockingbird Reaper 6, be advised North Tower has ZU-23, active and tracking. She acknowledged with a brief click, already lining up the cannon run that would either silence that gun or end her mission permanently. The targeting pipper settled on the tower's base, and she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 unleashed its distinctive roar, a sound so deep it resonated in chest cavities and survival instincts. 30mm rounds impacted concrete and steel at velocities that transformed matter into fragments. The tower's upper structure disintegrated, the anti-aircraft gun tumbling in slow motion before crashing into the compound yard. She pulled up hard, feeling G-forces compress her spine, and began another orbit. Fuel consumption ran ahead of projections. The auxiliary tanks were already showing concerning depletion rates. Mathematics didn't care about heroism or determination, only about thrust requirements versus available energy. Another threat tone screamed through her helmet. A tracking radar from the western ridge had acquired lock. She recognized the signature, Chinese HQ-9 system, sophisticated enough to ignore most countermeasures. The missile launch was inevitable, just a question of timing. She armed the remaining Mavericks, designated the radar emitter, and fired before the SAM could complete its launch sequence. Her missile raced across the valley faster than sound, impacting the radar antenna in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The threat tone cut out, but she knew other systems were already compensating, sharing target data across network defenses. Modern warfare didn't allow for solo victories against integrated air defense systems. She was buying seconds, not security. The compound's main building sat in her targeting reticle reinforced concrete that would require multiple hits to breach. Webb's voice came through again, tight with controlled urgency. Mockingbird, we have visual on hostage building, northwest corner, second floor. Windows are barred but intact. They're inside, confirmed 4 souls. She adjusted her attack axis, calculating angles that would suppress defensive fire without risking the hostages. The Hydra rockets armed with satisfying clicks transmitted through her flight controls. She pickled them in pairs, walking the impacts across vehicle positions and guard posts, each explosion creating momentary blind spots in the enemy's defensive network. Return fire intensified, tracers now coming from multiple positions, creating overlapping fields that turned portions of sky into zones of certain death. She threaded between them with movements that looked reckless but were actually precisely calculated gambles based on weapons traverse rates and ammunition reload times. A round punched through her left wing, clean through the aluminum skin, creating a hole she couldn't see but felt in the aircraft's handling. Fuel began venting from the puncture, a thin mist that glittered in the morning sun. Her fuel calculations just became academic exercises in optimism. The compound defenses were adapting, concentrating fire on her most likely approach vectors. Someone down their new tactics was coordinating the response with professional competence. She respected that even as she planned to kill them. The next gun run would be critical. She needed to create enough chaos for Webb's extraction team to breach the building. The Marines were somewhere in the surrounding terrain, waiting for her signal. She armed the cannon again, checked her remaining ammunition count, 700 rounds, enough for 2 more extended bursts, and committed to an approach that would take her directly over the compound center. Every weapons system down there would have optimal firing solutions. She accepted that reality and dove. The A-10 dropped like a predator stooping on prey, accelerating through airspace where survival became improbable. The cannon roared again, shells impacting in a line that chewed through vehicles, fighting positions, and the compound's communications antenna. Tracers converged on her aircraft from 5 different positions. She felt impacts, solid metallic strikes that sounded like ball-peen hammers against the airframe. Warning lights illuminated on the caution panel, hydraulic pressure fluctuating in the backup system, electrical fault in the starboard engine, oil temperature climbing toward critical. The Warthog absorbed punishment, its titanium bathtub protecting her from rounds that would have killed her in any other aircraft. She pulled up, straining the G-limits, and rolled out at an altitude that gave her visual confirmation of Webb's team breaching the building. Smoke grenades detonated, creating cover. The Marines moved with practiced efficiency, stacking on the doorway, blowing the locks, disappearing inside. Her job now was to keep every enemy combatant focused on her instead of them. She began another attack run, broadcasting her presence like a matador drawing the bull's attention. Time compressed into moments measured by weapons fire and radio calls. Webb's team had contact, was moving to the second floor, encountering resistance. She suppressed a position that threatened their route with her remaining Mavericks, the explosion close enough that she worried about fratricide even as she committed to the shot. The missile hit perfectly, collapsing a wall section and silencing the weapons firing from within. Her fuel gauge approached critical levels, the punctured tank bleeding their margin for error into the atmosphere. She ran calculations automatically: current fuel state, distance to base, minimum reserve requirements, time remaining on station. The numbers didn't work anymore. She was already committed beyond the point of guaranteed return. She'd known that possibility existed when she laughed at the general's suicide run assessment, but knowing abstractly and experiencing concretely were different things entirely. She continued her orbit, ready to expend the last of her ammunition if Webb needed more time. The radio crackled, and his voice carried something she hadn't heard before, urgency mixed with hope. Mockingbird, Reaper 6, we have all 4 packages, moving to extraction point Alpha 90 seconds. The compound erupted in concentrated fire, every remaining weapon trying to prevent the hostages' escape. She identified the heaviest concentration, a technical truck with a mounted heavy machine gun, and lined up what would be her final gun run. The ammunition counter showed 214 rounds remaining. She pressed the trigger and held it, walking the fire across the target until the truck exploded and the gun fell silent. The cannon wound down, barrels hot enough to shimmer the air around them, ammunition drum empty. She pulled up and transmitted 3 words: Mockingbird Winchester RTB. Winchester, pilot terminology for out of ammunition. RTB, returning to base, a phrase she used despite knowing the mathematics said otherwise. Webb acknowledged, thanking her with the formal courtesy of someone who understood what words couldn't express. She turned toward home, nursing throttles to maximize range, watching the fuel gauge with the detachment of someone already committed to outcome beyond her control. The mountains passed below, beautiful and indifferent, the same ridges that had hidden her approach now marking her path toward an uncertain return. The starboard engine's warning light transitioned from amber to red as oil pressure dropped below minimums. She shut it down according to emergency procedures, securing fuel and electrical systems before the engine could seize and damage surrounding components. The A-10 flew on one engine, performance degraded but still capable, a testament to the designers who'd planned for exactly this scenario. Fuel consumption improved slightly without the damaged engine's demand, but the mathematics remained brutal. She transmitted her situation to base operations, her voice carrying the clinical precision that training demanded. They acknowledged, scrambled the alert crew for search and rescue, and began calculating intercept points if she had to eject. The sun climbed higher, warming the cockpit, and she found herself noticing details she usually ignored. The way light caught on canopy scratches, the familiar scuffs on her gloves, the small photograph tucked into a corner of the instrument panel. Her daughter's second birthday, taken 3 deployments ago when staying home had still seemed possible. She'd become a pilot because her father said women couldn't handle the physical demands. She'd joined the military because he said she'd never survive the culture. Every flight became a small rebellion against limitations others had tried to impose. The fuel gauge showed amounts measured in minutes rather than miles. She began calculating potential landing sites, analyzing terrain for anything flat enough and long enough to survive a deadstick landing. The valleys offered nothing promising, too narrow, too rocky, too occupied by people who would either kill her or ransom her. She continued toward base, squeezing every possible minute from the remaining fuel, running the engine at optimal efficiency even as systems degraded around her. The remaining engine's temperature climbed toward redline. She adjusted mixture and throttle, coaxing performance from machinery that had already given everything. Radio calls from base operations became more frequent, asking for her fuel state, her engine parameters, her intentions. She responded with numbers that told their own story about probabilities and outcomes. They asked if she wanted to divert to a forward operating base, closer but more primitive. She considered the option and declined. If she was going down, she'd go down trying to reach home. The radio fell quiet, everyone understanding what the silence meant. 30 miles from Bagram, the low fuel warning chimed, a sound she'd heard in training but never in combat. The gauge showed amounts technically sufficient but realistically insufficient given the degraded engine performance. She began the emergency descent checklist, preparing for the possibility of flaming out before reaching the runway. The remaining engine coughed, stuttered, continued running on fumes and momentum. She could see the base now, distant but distinct, the runway visible as a gray line against the brown earth. Tower control cleared all traffic, gave her priority handling, and she imagined the fire trucks rolling toward their alert positions, foam crews preparing for the worst. The altimeter unwound through 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000, the engine still running on what must have been vapor and determination. At 2,000 feet, she entered the pattern, banking gently to preserve what little energy remained. The landing gear deployed with reassuring mechanical certainty, 3 green lights confirming wheels down and locked. She turned final, lined up the runway, and felt the engine surge one last time before its death rattle began. The propeller windmilled in her slipstream, generating drag but no thrust. The runway threshold passed below her nose, and she transitioned into the flare, trading altitude for time, the settling toward concrete with the resignation of something that had given everything. The main gear touched down with a chirp of rubber, the nose wheel followed, and she had no power for thrust reversers or rollout. The aircraft slowed through momentum and drag, rolling past the emergency crews who'd expected fire and wreckage. She taxied on residual momentum to the dearming area, shut down the remaining systems, and sat in sudden silence that felt profound after hours of engine noise and combat chaos. Her hands shook slightly, adrenaline draining now that the crisis had ended. She completed the post-flight checklist with automatic precision, documenting systems failures and ammunition expenditure, noting the battle damage that maintenance would need to assess. When she finally climbed down from the cockpit, her legs felt uncertain beneath her. Alvarez met her there, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed his wounded aircraft. They counted holes together, 17 through the wings, 8 through the fuselage, 1 through the vertical stabilizer. The titanium bathtub showed scoring but no penetrations. The Warthog had brought her home despite everything. She patted the fuselage with genuine affection, thanking it the way others thanked deities. Alvarez said it would fly again, given enough work and parts. She believed him because the alternative was unacceptable. The debriefing lasted 4 hours, analysts and intelligence officers dissecting every moment of the mission, requesting clarifications and confirmations that would eventually become classified reports. She walked them through the attack sequence, the target prioritization, the damage assessment, speaking in the technical language that reduced chaos to procedural descriptions. General Hawkins attended via video conference from Central Command, his expression unreadable behind the compression artifacts of satellite connection. When she finished, he asked one question: would she do it again? She considered the question seriously, thought about the fuel calculations that hadn't worked, the engine failure that almost killed her, the rounds that came too close. She thought about 4 Marines returning to families who'd been preparing for the worst. She said yes, she'd do it again, and meant it completely. The general nodded slowly, ended the connection without further comment. The intelligence officers wrapped their session with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask their recognition that they'd witnessed something unusual. As Raven left the operations building, stepping into afternoon sun that felt dislocated after the fluorescent debriefing room, she found a crowd waiting. Mechanics from her maintenance crew, pilots from other squadrons, even administrative personnel who normally inhabited different worlds entirely. They didn't cheer or applaud, the military culture too reserved for such displays, but they stood there witnessing her return with a solemnity that carried more weight than celebration. Lieutenant Commander Webb pushed through the crowd, still wearing combat gear dusty from the extraction operation. Behind him came 4 Marines, exhausted and stunned, bearing injuries both visible and otherwise. The youngest couldn't have been more than 23, his corporal stripes still bright against faded camouflage. He approached with the awkward determination of someone attempting something unfamiliar. His salute was regulation perfect, but his voice cracked slightly when he thanked her for bringing him home. She returned the salute, told him that's what pilots do, and felt the inadequacy of words to bridge the distance between aerial combat and ground-level gratitude. The senator's son stood apart, recognizable from briefing photos but diminished by captivity and trauma. He didn't approach, just met her eyes across the distance and nodded once, warrior to warrior, survivor to survivor, acknowledging debts that couldn't be repaid because they exceeded any system of accounting. Webb waited until the others dispersed before speaking. He said what she already knew. Her flight had been textbook impossible, the kind of mission that would be studied and debated and probably never attempted again. She accepted the assessment without false modesty or pride, just recognition of what had occurred. The days following the mission carried a strange quality of unreality, normal routines continuing while something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. She flew training missions, conducted maintenance checks, attended the mundane briefings that filled military life between moments of crisis. But conversations would halt when she entered rooms. Junior officers watched her with obvious awe. Senior officers maintained careful distance, unsure how to classify someone who'd violated probability and survived. The mission reports began circulating through classified channels, acquiring annotations and analyses from staff officers who'd never pulled GS or felt rounds impact their aircraft. A Defense Department analyst requested her tactical decision-making process, trying to codify improvisation and experience into doctrine. She declined politely, explaining that what she'd done wasn't replicable procedure but responsive adaptation to specific circumstances. The analyst persisted, suggesting her techniques could save lives if properly disseminated. She considered that argument carefully before agreeing to a limited tactical review, knowing that some knowledge transfers and some remains locked in the wordless communion between pilot and machine. 3 weeks after the mission, she received notification to report to General Hawkins' office at Central Command Headquarters. The summons came without context or explanation, just typed orders on official letterhead. She traveled in dress uniform, uncertain what awaited. The general's office occupied a converted hangar space, its walls covered with maps and operational displays showing the constant chess game of deployment and response. Hawkins stood when she entered, gesturing to a chair with the weary courtesy of someone who'd spent too many years making impossible decisions. He spoke without preamble about courage, competence, and the peculiar mathematics of military value. Her mission had accomplished tactical objectives that formal analysis suggested required 3 times the resources at 5 times the risk. The hostage rescue would likely prevent a propaganda catastrophe that could have destabilized regional politics. Those outcomes mattered to Pentagon strategists and congressional committees, but Hawkins wanted to discuss something different. He asked about the moment she'd stood in the briefing room and volunteered for a mission everyone else had declared impossible. What had she seen that the fighter pilots and analysts had missed? She considered the question carefully, recognizing it as something more than curiosity. She explained that different aircraft create different possibilities, that the A-10's low-speed maneuverability and survivability opened tactical options that speed and sophistication closed. She'd studied those mountains, recognized the approach corridors, understood that sometimes the old, ugly, underestimated solution succeeds precisely because it's unexpected. Hawkins listened without interruption, his expression shifting through reactions she couldn't fully read. When she finished, he opened a folder on his desk and slid a single paper across its scarred surface. The document bore the presidential seal and formal language announcing her nomination for the Air Force Cross, the service's second highest decoration for extraordinary heroism in combat. She stared at the words, feeling their weight in ways that transcended the paper's physical mass. The general explained the bureaucratic process ahead, endorsements, reviews, the formal ceremony that would eventually occur if the nomination survived scrutiny. He said the recommendation was unanimous among everyone who'd reviewed the mission files. Then he said something else, something personal rather than procedural. He admitted he'd been wrong that morning in the briefing room, wrong to dismiss her aircraft, wrong to underestimate her assessment, wrong to let assumptions about capabilities override evidence of competence. The admission cost him something visible, the kind of professional humility that senior officers rarely displayed. She accepted it with the grace it deserved, acknowledging that uncertainty and doubt existed on both sides of every decision, that outcomes proved nothing except that this specific roll of dice had succeeded. They shook hands, and she departed carrying the weight of recognition she hadn't sought but couldn't refuse. The nominations circulated through channels with the slow inevitability of bureaucracy conducting due diligence. Investigators interviewed witnesses, reviewed flight recorder data, cross-referenced her account against intelligence assessments and weapons expenditure reports. The process consumed months while she returned to rotation schedules and training cycles. Some pilots treated her differently now, keeping respectful distance or seeking advice with the awkward reverence of those encountering something they couldn't fully comprehend. Others maintained studied normalcy, recognizing that treating her as exceptional would create the kind of separation that ruins unit cohesion. She preferred the latter group, the ones who still gave her grief about flying a slow-moving gun platform while they piloted real fighters. The banter contained affection beneath the mockery, acknowledgement that different missions required different tools. Lieutenant Commander Webb deployed to another theater, but they maintained occasional communication through official channels and personal messages that carefully avoided classified details. He reported that the Marines she'd extracted were recovering, processing trauma through the military's sometimes adequate, sometimes insufficient support systems. The senator's son had written a letter she hadn't yet opened, uncertain how to receive gratitude for actions she'd considered duty rather than heroism. The ceremony occurred on a spring afternoon at Andrews Air Force Base, formal and choreographed with military precision. Dignitaries attended, the Secretary of Defense, congressional representatives, senior military leadership whose stars and ribbons represented lifetimes of service. Her family stood in the second row, her mother crying quietly, her daughter fidgeting in an uncomfortable dress while trying to understand why everyone was watching her mom. Her father hadn't come, the estrangement still too deep for this bridge to cross. She'd stopped expecting reconciliation years ago, finding her own definitions of worth independent of his approval. The citation was read aloud, formal language describing the mission in terms that somehow captured and missed its reality simultaneously. Words like extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety reduced complex calculations and necessary risks to simple narratives of courage. The Air Force Cross itself gleamed against blue velvet. Bronze and enamel formed into a symbol that carried weight beyond its physical components. When the secretary pinned it to her uniform, photographers captured the moment for official records and historical archives. She stood at attention, accepting the recognition while knowing the mission's real meaning existed somewhere beneath the ceremony's surface, in the wordless space between decision and outcome that only those who'd lived it could truly understand. The reception following the ceremony filled a base conference room with dress uniforms and awkward conversation between people whose paths rarely intersected. She navigated the social obligations with practiced courtesy, accepting congratulations from officers and officials, deflecting attention toward her maintenance crews and intelligence analysts whose contributions enabled her success. Senator Morty approached near the reception's end, his presence announced by security personnel and political gravity. He shook her hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to such gestures, thanked her for returning his son with words that carried genuine emotion beneath polished delivery. She accepted his gratitude without elaboration, understanding that some experiences created debts that acknowledgement couldn't repay. He mentioned legislation he was sponsoring to increase funding for A-10 sustainment, recognition that capability and glamour didn't always align. She nodded politely, aware that political support emerged from complex motivations only partially related to her mission. Her daughter tugged at her dress uniform, demanding attention with the directness of 7-year-old impatience. Raven excused herself from senatorial conversation and knelt to her child's level, letting the room's noise fade into background while focusing on questions about medals and airplanes, and whether Mommy had been scared. She answered honestly that yes, she'd been scared, that courage meant acting despite fear rather than its absence. The years following the ceremony brought changes subtle and profound. She advanced through ranks with the steady progression of competent officers, acquiring administrative responsibilities that pulled her farther from cockpit hours. The A-10 fleet faced periodic retirement debates, congressional battles over whether to replace old warhorses with newer, more expensive alternatives. She testified before committees, providing technical assessments about capabilities and limitations, trying to prevent procurement decisions from becoming solely financial exercises divorced from tactical reality. Some contracts were awarded, others canceled, the usual chaos of defense acquisition playing out across budget cycles. She mentored younger pilots, passing along hard-won knowledge about energy management and threat assessment, watching new generations struggle with the same challenges she'd faced. The military culture changed incrementally, old barriers eroding while new ones emerged, progress measured in small victories and persistent frustrations. Female pilots became less unusual but still noteworthy, their competence still sometimes questioned in ways male counterparts avoided. She addressed those attitudes directly when necessary, through performance and occasionally through blunt conversations that left no ambiguity about standards or expectations. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, as she'd become, received new assignments, instructor pilot positions, operational planning roles, eventually a squadron command that came with leadership responsibilities she'd spent years preparing to handle. The call sign Mockingbird followed her through each transition, acquiring layers of meaning as junior officers learned its origin story and adopted their own interpretations. Some heard it as a celebration of underestimated capability. Others understood it as a warning about assumptions and their costs. A few recognized it as something more complex, acknowledgement that survival sometimes required becoming what circumstances demanded, adapting to hostile environments through intelligence and determination. She wore the name with pride tempered by perspective, knowing that identity emerged from choices made under pressure, from the accumulated weight of decisions both large and small. Her daughter grew into adolescence asking questions about military service and gender dynamics, whether her mother regretted choosing a career that demanded constant proof of worth. Raven answered honestly. Regret was complicated, that she'd paid prices for paths chosen but couldn't imagine having accepted limitations others tried to impose. She hoped her daughter would face fewer barriers, but prepared her for the reality that progress remained incomplete, that competence often needed to be demonstrated repeatedly before being acknowledged fully. The A-10 she'd flown that morning over Kandahar eventually reached its maintenance limits, too many flight hours and combat damage accumulations for economical repair. It was retired to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, joining thousands of other aircraft in the desert's preserving dryness. Before the final flight, she visited the aircraft one last time, walking slowly around its scarred exterior, remembering specific moments tied to specific dents and patches. Alvarez had moved to civilian contracting but returned for the occasion, their shared history transcending normal boundaries between officer and enlisted. They didn't speak much, just stood in companionable silence, acknowledging what the machine represented, not just metal and systems, but the physical manifestation of a particular moment when everything aligned precisely enough for survival. Someone from the Air Force Museum had inquired about acquiring the aircraft for permanent display, recognizing its historical significance beyond normal combat service. The request was pending approval through channels that moved slowly when not moving at all. She hoped it would be preserved, that future pilots might see it and understand that effectiveness sometimes wore ugly, unexpected forms. But outcomes lay beyond her control now, determined by bureaucrats and budgeting committees whose priorities shifted with political winds. Colonel Vasquez, eventually, accepted a position at the Air Force Weapons School, teaching advanced tactics to pilots selected for their demonstrated capabilities and potential for leadership. The assignment brought her to Nellis Air Force Base, where Nevada's stark ranges provided training environments approximating combat conditions. She designed scenarios based on real missions, including variations of the Kandahar extraction with different aircraft, different terrain, different threat arrays. Students struggled with the exercise, discovering that no clean solutions existed, that every approach carried costs requiring calculated acceptance. Some adapted, finding creative approaches within the scenario's constraints. Others failed repeatedly until frustration forced reevaluation of assumptions. She graded less on success than on decision-making process, on whether pilots recognized the difference between recklessness and calculated risk, between bravado and competence. The best students asked questions that revealed understanding of complexity, queries about fuel calculations, weapons effectiveness, civilian considerations, political implications. They recognized that combat aviation existed within broader contexts that technical proficiency alone couldn't navigate. The weakest students focused on technology and firepower, believing superior equipment guaranteed outcomes. She worked hardest with that group, trying to instill perspective before they encountered real bullets and real consequences. The students called her Mockingbird, the call sign having transcended personal designation to become something larger. They'd studied her mission in tactics classes, reviewed flight recorder data and weapons camera footage, analyzed her decisions with the comfortable distance of academic exercise. Most had never experienced actual combat, their experience limited to training ranges and simulated threats. She remembered that innocence, recognized it in their questions and assumptions. Some would maintain that innocence, serving entire careers without facing enemy fire. Others would encounter their defining moments, discovering capabilities and limitations that no training could fully predict. She couldn't tell them which they'd be, only prepare them as thoroughly as possible for whichever outcome emerged. The Air Force Cross sat in a display case in her office, visible to visitors but peripheral to her daily awareness. It represented a single day extracted from a career of accumulated days, important but not definitive. Students sometimes asked about it, curiosity overcoming military reticence about personal decorations. She answered their questions factually, describing the mission's tactical elements without dwelling on its emotional weight. What she couldn't explain, what language struggled to capture, was the feeling of flying through sky turned hostile, of machinery absorbing violence meant for her, of decisions made in seconds carrying consequences lasting lifetimes. Those experiences remained locked in the private spaces where memory and meaning intersected, accessible only to those who'd inhabited similar moments. The years accumulated with startling speed, each bringing new challenges and small triumphs, losses and adaptations. She watched conflicts erupt and resolve, or fail to resolve, seeing patterns repeat across geography and politics. The A-10 fleet survived another round of retirement debates, preserved by congressional intervention and tactical necessity that transcended budget efficiency arguments. New pilots learned to fly the Warthog, discovering its peculiar handling and devastating effectiveness. Some sought her advice, pilgrimage visits from young officers wanting to understand how she'd accomplished what mission planners had declared impossible. She offered what guidance she could, emphasizing fundamentals over mythology, preparation over inspiration. The mission's legend had grown beyond its reality in some tellings, accreting impossible details and supernatural competence. She corrected exaggerations when possible, knowing that distortion served neither memory nor instruction. What she'd done was difficult, dangerous, and successful, but not beyond the realm of achievable outcomes given training, experience, and specific circumstances. Replicability mattered more than hero worship. If her mission's primary lesson was that single pilots could perform miracles, then its value was limited. If instead it demonstrated that competence combined with determination could expand possibility beyond initial assessment, Then perhaps future pilots would benefit from studying it seriously rather than mythologizing it romantically. Brigadier General Vasquez, in her final promotion, took command of operational wings responsible for training and tactics development across multiple aircraft platforms. The promotion brought her to the Pentagon, where combat experience informed policy debates and procurement decisions that affected thousands of personnel. She navigated that environment with the same tactical awareness she'd applied to combat flying, recognizing that influence required understanding political terrain as thoroughly as geographic terrain. Some considered the Pentagon assignment a departure from real military work, a necessary evil of senior leadership. She viewed it differently, recognizing that strategic decisions made in conference rooms ultimately determined what happened in cockpits over hostile territory. Her voice carried weight others lacked, grounded in combat experience that couldn't be dismissed as theoretical perspective. When budget analysts suggested cutting pilot training hours to reduce costs, she provided data about proficiency degradation and combat effectiveness. When acquisition officers promoted systems based solely on technical specifications, she asked questions about maintainability, reliability, and how equipment performed when damaged. She protected programs others might have sacrificed, defended capabilities that seemed obsolete, until specific scenarios proved their enduring value. The A-10, repeatedly threatened with retirement, survived partially because she articulated its continuing relevance in conflicts where precision matters less than presence, where ability to absorb damage and continue fighting creates options no other platform provides. Her office accumulated artifacts across years of service, unit patches from squadrons commanded, photographs from deployments survived, letters from pilots she'd mentored who'd gone on to their own achievements. The Air Force Cross held place of honor, but surrounding it were reminders of accumulated experiences that formed complete careers rather than singular moments. A challenge coin from Alvarez, given upon his retirement, engraved with the Mockingbird call sign and a warthog silhouette. A photograph of her daughter's college graduation, proof that some balances between duty and family had been navigated successfully despite difficulty. A hand-drawn thank you card from a pilot she'd mentored through a crisis of confidence, helping them discover capability they doubted existed. These artifacts told stories that military records couldn't capture, the human dimensions of professional service that existed alongside tactical accomplishments. She understood that her legacy would ultimately encompass more than one mission, however significant, that influence measured across decades teaching, leading, and advocating mattered as much as individual acts of courage. Yet she also recognized that the Kandahar mission remained defining in ways both fair and limiting, the event by which many would always primarily know her. She'd made peace with that reality, accepting that simplification occurred naturally when complex lives were reduced to memorable moments. The morning she received retirement orders, 30 years after commissioning, felt simultaneously abrupt and overdue. Her body carried accumulated wear from decades of high-G maneuvers and cramped cockpits, injuries minor and major that eventually demanded acknowledgement. Her mind remained sharp, but institutional knowledge was transferring to newer generations who would face challenges she couldn't fully anticipate. The military's mandatory retirement structures didn't recognize individual preferences about timing, only years of service and rank held. She accepted the transition without resentment, understanding that organizations required constant renewal to prevent stagnation. The retirement ceremony followed familiar scripts, speeches about dedicated service and significant contributions, presentations of flags and plaques commemorating milestones. Fellow officers attended, many wearing their own decorations earned across similar spans of time. Her daughter spoke briefly, expressing pride mixed with relief that her mother would finally face reduced risk of death or serious injury. The statement earned gentle laughter from the audience, recognition of the strain military families endured. What remained unspoken What couldn't be easily articulated in public ceremony was the complex mixture of identity and purpose that military service provided. How deeply professional identity intertwined with personal identity over decades of defining oneself through that work. The transition to civilian life proved more disorienting than anticipated. Mornings without flight schedules or operational briefings felt unmoored from purpose. She consulted for defense contractors, taught occasional seminars at military institutions, served on boards that evaluated tactics and training. The work was meaningful, but felt peripheral compared to direct operational responsibility. She learned gradually that identity required conscious reconstruction after career's end, that who she was existed independent of uniform and rank, but needed active definition. She reconnected with family relationships strained by decades of deployment and duty. She traveled to places previously known only through military operations, seeing them as tourist rather than combatant. She wrote, initially for her own clarity but eventually for publication, trying to capture lessons about leadership and decision-making that transcended military context. The writing was difficult, requiring vulnerability she'd protected behind professional competence for decades. She worked with a ghostwriter who helped translate tactical language into accessible narrative, producing a book that examined her career's arc including but not centered solely on the Kandahar mission. The book's title came from a junior pilot she'd once mentored, underestimated. The single word captured something essential about her experience and, she hoped, something useful for others facing similar dismissals. The book's publication brought unexpected attention, media interviews, speaking engagements, invitations to conferences on leadership and military reform. She accepted selectively, uncomfortable with celebrity but willing to advance conversations about capability, diversity, and institutional change. Some interviews focused predictably on gender dynamics, wanting her to represent broader patterns of discrimination and barrier breaking. She answered those questions honestly, but resisted becoming solely defined by gender, emphasizing that competence and courage existed across demographics when opportunity and training were provided. Other interviews explored tactical details, hosted by military-focused podcasts and analysis channels whose audiences wanted technical precision over inspirational narrative. She preferred those conversations, discussing weapon systems and threat assessments, energy management and fuel calculations. The specific details mattered, carried lessons that generalizations obscured. A few interviewers asked about fear, about how she'd managed psychological pressure of flying into situations others had deemed suicidal. She answered truthfully that fear never disappeared, that courage meant acting despite its presence, and that training and preparation transformed fear from paralyzing force into manageable background sensation, requiring acknowledgement but not submission. The most insightful interviewer, herself, a veteran of different conflicts, asked what Raven would tell her younger self if given the opportunity. The question surprised her into genuine reflection. Eventually, she answered that she'd tell that younger pilot to trust her assessments, that being underestimated created advantages if you didn't internalize the doubt, and that the moments that define you emerge unexpectedly from the accumulated weight of smaller moments that prepared you to meet them. Years into retirement, she received unexpected visitors, a documentary crew researching combat aviation's evolution, wanting to film her discussing the Kandahar mission for historical record. She agreed after confirming they'd interview others involved, that the documentary wouldn't center solely on her actions but would include maintenance crews, intelligence analysts, the Marines extracted, the broader operational context. The filming occurred at Davis-Monthan's Boneyard, where her old A-10 had been preserved, as the museum acquisition request finally cleared bureaucratic channels. Standing beside the aircraft decades after flying it brought unexpected emotion. Not nostalgia exactly, but recognition of connection between person and machine that had enabled survival. The documentary crew asked her to explain the mission, while the aircraft provided visual context. She walked them through the approach corridors, the weapons employment sequence, the emergency procedures that had barely saved her. The director asked her to describe what she'd felt during the final approach, when fuel was nearly exhausted and the engine was failing. She struggled to articulate it properly, settling finally on a simple truth. She'd felt alive in ways that made survival urgent not from fear, but from determination to experience whatever came next. The footage would eventually air as part of a series about military aviation, her segment one chapter in a larger story about technology, tactics, and the humans who employed them. She hoped viewers would understand that the mission's success resulted from preparation meeting opportunity, from systems and training functioning as designed under pressure that tested, but didn't exceed their limits. The documentary's broadcast brought renewed attention, a new generation discovering her story through digital media and sharing it across platforms she barely understood. Videos analyzing her tactics accumulated millions of views. Discussion forums debated technical details and speculated about alternative approaches. Some comments celebrated her accomplishment, others questioned various details. A few dismissed the entire account as exaggerated or fabricated. She didn't engage with online discourse, recognizing that internet debate existed in spaces where nuance died and certainty flourished regardless of evidence. What mattered was that conversations continued about capability, competence, and the persistent challenge of assumptions limiting opportunity. Young pilots contacted her through various channels, describing how her story had influenced their career decisions, giving them confidence to pursue paths others had discouraged. Those messages meant more than medals or promotions, evidence that experience shared could expand possibility for others. She responded personally when possible, offering encouragement and realistic assessment of challenges they'd face. She didn't promise easy paths or guaranteed outcomes, only that competence eventually proved itself if given opportunity, and that creating those opportunities sometimes required persistence against institutional momentum that preferred comfortable assumptions. The final scene of this story doesn't occur at a ceremony or during some dramatic moment of reflection. It happens on an ordinary morning when Raven Vasquez, now in her 60s, visits an Air Force base to speak with pilot candidates beginning their training. She stands before a classroom of young people whose diversity would have seemed impossible when she'd started her own career. Women and men from backgrounds representing America's full spectrum, united by shared ambition to fly military aircraft in service of something larger than themselves. She doesn't tell them war stories or inspire them with dramatic accounts of combat missions. Instead, she talks about fundamentals, the importance of mastering systems, the value of learning from failure, the necessity of honest self-assessment. She explains that competence builds through accumulated small improvements, that excellence emerges from disciplined attention to detail across thousands of repetitions. She tells them they'll face moments when others doubt their capabilities, when institutional culture questions their presence, when failure seems not just possible but probable. In those moments, she says, they must trust their training and their judgment, must distinguish between legitimate limitations and imposed restrictions that can be overcome through skill and determination. She doesn't mention the Air Force Cross, doesn't describe the Kandahar mission, doesn't position herself as someone whose achievements they should strive to replicate. She simply stands before them as evidence that the path exists, that barriers can be crossed, that underestimation need not determine outcome. After the presentation, several students approach with questions. One asks her call sign's origin. She explains it briefly, and the student nods with understanding that carries forward into whatever flights await them. Another asks what she considers her greatest achievement. She pauses, considering the question seriously, then answers, still being here, still trying to help others fly farther than she managed. The student looks confused, having expected something more dramatic, but Raven sees a few others nodding, the ones who have already begun to understand that careers are built across years, not moments, and that influence compounds through example and guidance shared across generations. She leaves the classroom knowing some will succeed and others will wash out, that some will face combat while others serve entire careers in peacetime. She can't determine their outcomes, only hopes she's contributed something useful to their preparation. Walking across the flight line toward her car, she hears the distinctive whine of turbofans spooling up, a flight of A-10s preparing for a training mission. The sound carries her across decades instantly, muscle memory responding to familiar acoustics that once meant life or death. She pauses, watching the aircraft taxi, their ungainly profiles somehow beautiful in purpose if not form. The lead pilot salutes from the cockpit, recognition between generations of warriors who have inherited and will pass forward traditions worth preserving. She returns the salute crisply, then continues toward her car carrying the knowledge that the legacy that matters isn't carved in medals or monuments, but lives in the pilots who will face their own impossible missions and find ways to bring themselves and their people home.